Test, test, turbo manifolds, looking fat. Welcome back to Post Projects and Project 818 SRX. Just about got the engine buttoned up and ready to put back in, but before I do, I want to talk about oil pans, specifically with regards to race cars and tracking. Now, most high-end race cars go dry sump, which essentially they no longer have a pool of oil sitting in the bottom of the tank. They just have a reservoir that they pump oil through the engine. It involves a oil pump that bolts to the side of the motor and runs off a belt. Now, there are options for the 13B for dry sump. I'm not sure if Mazda Motorsports' kit is still available, but there are aftermarket kits, and that is an option. For me, a big issue for trying to fit one would be space. The main crank pulley actually sits kind of in the that little, or sits right up against, sorry, the firewall in the back, and the alternator pulley actually sits inside that little A-frame of the firewall, or the little A-frame that the firewall bolts to. So I don't have a lot of front clearance to add another pulley or to run a wider, like ribbed style pulley that you normally run in an oil cooler, or room to put the pump. Now, with everything else in the project, I could make that room, but the other downside of dry sumps is expense. You're looking at $3,000 to $5,000 US for a dry sump kit installed by the time you get everything. And it's quite expensive. Now, the Subaru guys are having issues with tracking the 818. I should say the 818 guys with Subaru engines are having issues on track tracking the 818, where you get slosh in the oil pan. So if you're running a regular wet sump, you got your oil pickup is in here, oil sloshes to one side during a long corner with enough G-force, which the 818 can generate. So what happens is the oil sloshes to one side, and it goes far enough to one side that this is no longer submerged in oil. The pump then sucks in air and you lose oil pressure. It doesn't take long to lose oil pressure on track before things get ugly really quick. And we've seen what happens when you lose oil pressure on a rotary, and that wasn't even at high RPM racing conditions. That was just cruising down the highway that I did all that damage. So we know that the 818 can pull enough G's to cause issues with the wet sump in the Subaru motor, in the EJ. We don't know if it's going to be an issue with the FD motor and the FD's oil pan. I didn't find a whole lot of information as far as racing, road racing, an FD with a wet sump. The pro teams, of course, all use dry sump. All the competitions. It's also almost a 30-year-old car, certainly over 25 years since it came out. So it's not exactly being raced regular anymore. There's a few aftermarket oil pans for the FD motor. It seems that the oil slosh was more of an issue for the earlier RX7s, but by the time they got to the FD, as you can see, the FD oil pan is quite baffled. I'll get into that in a second. There are some aftermarket options. None of them that in my opinion are any better than this. You can get them deeper to hold more oil. Some of them offer less baffling than this, and then people go above that and baffle them. And I'm going to get into why I'm sticking with the stock pan and how I'm going to address the few issues that exists. One of the main issues guys are finding with the FD motor is lack of venting. That carries through all rotary engines. Because guys have the same issue with the RX8, and adding catch cans is a bonus, but you kind of want to vent a few spots. So right now I'm venting at the filler neck, and then I'm also venting at the turbo rear oil drain, which is back here somewhere. There it is. Because I'm not running a twin turbo, I'm using the front oil drain for the draining my turbo, and then the rear oil drain comes up to the catch can. So I'm venting from both sides, which is a big plus. Some guys go as far as venting from the front cover, although I'm not sure that's necessary. I couldn't find much of that. So venting from both sides with a decent size. So I've got dash 10 on both sides. So I'm venting to the catch can, which is good. The other issue would be pushing oil, or filling the catch can by pushing oil up the filler side of the engine, which is the driver's side. So when you're turning right, or a sustained turn, right turn, oil actually traveling up this side. So if you look in the FD motor, we've got a straight shot, fairly open on this side, and a straight shot up to the filler neck. This side, there's not a whole lot. We don't need there's no windage, there's no crank going on here. There's not actually a whole lot going on the passenger side. On the driver's side, it's open more, and this is what happens: is your oil sloshes up this side of the motor, and then if you get a little bit of pressure in there, I'm not really sure how the pressure is getting in there, but guys are talking about like crankcase pressure. I think it's just more or less oil just sloshing up that side. There's oil's allowed to, and also up the front. If you look at the factory pan, again, quite baffled. If you look at, you've probably seen, I've got my baffle plate here, but a lot of baffle plates basically are pointless. If anything, they're just like a stiffening for the block, because they leave this side open, they leave this all open, and they leave this all open. So what really are you doing? You're not adding any more baffling. They're called a baffle plate. There's a few of them out there, and in my opinion, they're not doing anything. So the oil pickup goes right here. This is where your oil fill and dipstick come down, and then this would be the passenger side. So it actually goes like this here. So my oil pan came with this hole I put in, so ignore that for a minute. It came with a plug in this hole. According to Mastertrix, there's supposed to be 4 plugs in this. This was a new oil pan, and I think I might have ordered it from Mastertrix. It's been a couple of years now, and they say there's 4 plugs for this oil pan. Now there's one hole here, there's another hole just like it in this, only one hole in this side. It's right here, so I'm guessing that was supposed to be plugged. And then there's what seems to be drain holes, one here and one here, coming from this baffle, that I guess in theory, if those were all plugged, these would be filled with air, and it just provides a barrier so that oil is not able to slosh. Now again, oil is sloshing up here in FDs and causes an issue. So a couple of things. One, I drilled this other hole and I pulled this plug out. I don't want these to be filled with air. I see when I was cleaning out the pan, I couldn't help but notice that when I tipped it this way, oil was draining out these drain holes. So if the pickup sits right here like this, and there's oil in these two, when the engine is experiencing G's and the oil is sloshing to this side, well then these are just going to drain at the pickup, which is good. We want that. And likewise, when it drains this way, it'll now drain out again at the pickup. So I want these to fill with oil. I'm pretty sure they were filling with oil beforehand. I just want them to stay full. So I pulled this plug out and I put a hole here, and that's going to just allow oil to completely fill that up, and it won't ever be a void. Okay. Now let's get into my baffle plate. So 1/4 inch aluminum. It's a rather tight fit on the studs. I'm using 30 mil long, 6 mil studs, and it kind of fits like that. All the holes that I drilled, I did taper them from the top side my thinking that it would help drain. However, the oil level does sit, I guess, above this. We're looking at the engine upside down, but this in theory would be submerged all the time. I wanted it to be a tight fit on the studs because it does add that little bit of rigidity to the block, but how much that helps, I'm not really sure. It's certainly more than the oil pan braces, which is basically just a ring of steel that goes around the oil pan. Am I going to have leaks? Maybe. So that's the other downside to going to this style. I now have to seal between this and the block and this in the oil pan. So now I have twice as much area for it to leak. This pan wasn't leaking. I installed it on this engine. It wasn't leaking. It's not a daily driver. I've got good access to the oil pan should I ever need to service it. So I'm not going to worry too much about the leaks. I could have just built a new oil pan off this, but you know what, this works, and I think I'm just going to improve on this a little bit with the combination of this baffle plate, drilling that hole, and it should solve most of the problems. We can still drain and in the front, and we still can fill no problem on this side. It's just going to prevent slosh to the front, slosh to here, slosh to the driver's side. The passenger side, there's not a whole lot to go there. It can still drain there fine. It can still move around. These are my two holes that line up with the plate, and then that just kind of fits on there. Now you'll notice my oil pan, or my oil pickup, I just drilled this out. This will bolt right here, so this will be in its normal location inside this pan, and this is basically acting as a spacer for the oil pickup as well. I'm also gonna run a magnetic drain plug. Just I think those are good cheap insurance, but the reason I bring it up is the factory drain plug, which I'll have to grab here. Is quite a bit shorter. So if you're looking to run a magnetic drain plug, your generic M14 by 1.5 drain plugs are going to be longer with this magnet, unless you can find a real short one like this. The threads in the oil pan do not go all the way through. So if you got one like this and you tried to thread it in there, it's not going to go all the way. It's going to hit the sheet metal. Basically you've got like a pressed in fitting here, and the pressed in fitting is threaded, the sheet metal is not. So you are going to get burrs if you put this in and you tried to get it all the way in, and you probably get some resistance. I'm sure it would thread in, but now you've just put shavings in your oil pan. So if you are going to switch out to a longer style like this, the only time to do it would be with your oil pan off, so that you can run a tap through there and then clean out any shavings like I did. So if you do grab one of these and you try to thread it in there, you're not going to have much luck. I won't be using any gaskets for installing this. I am going to use a gasket on this, on the oil pickup, but around the outside there wasn't a gasket on it. Mazda scrapped using a gasket somewhere along the lines. This motor was between, I think, 96 and 99, a series, I don't know what that it was, 7 I think, or 8. They stopped using gaskets, so when I pulled this engine apart, it was just silicone. So I'm going to be using Permatex Optimum Black. I mean, come on, it has an oil pan right on the package. It's got to be the right stuff, right? There's all kinds of comments on what works best. I think it's more along the lines of prep and install. So making sure everything is really clean, and then putting a good continuous bead all the way around, hand tightening it. Generally I like to leave it for an hour and then torque it, so it lets it solidify up a little bit, but it's still flexible enough that when you torque it down it conforms. But if you torque it down right away, it just squishes out and doesn't actually serve the purpose that we're hoping that it does. So I'm going to go ahead and get this wrapped up, and then I'll talk about the other couple of changes I put on the engine and what else I'm going to do to the car before I can put this in. So anyone who knows anything about rotaries know that they run hot, quite a bit hotter than their piston counterparts, probably comparable to a turbo diesel towing a heavy load. So it is important to monitor exhaust gas temperature. I measure in both runners pre-turbo. You can also get an idea of if one rotor is running leaner or hotter than the other, just based off of that. Now, I was getting rather higher than I would like intake air temperatures. It was around 15 to 20 degrees outside, and I was getting closer to 30 degrees intake air temperature. Now, there's multiple reasons for that. I have made some efforts to control the heat. However, there's a lot more I can do. One of those things I can do is some ceramic coating. I had heat shielding on the exhaust and a little bit of the turbo, but the air filter is rather close to the turbo. So anything I can do to minimize that, the better. Also, because on the rotary engine, you might be able to see it behind me, the intake and the exhaust are on the same side of the engine. So there's a certain amount of radiant heat always going to get into that intake manifold. So I gold wrapped the intake manifold, and I have ceramic coated the exhaust manifold, both inside and out. It's completely smooth. Hopefully it'll focus on that. Now, it was wrapped before. I'm going to wrap it again on top of the ceramic coating. I also had the turbine housing coated. It's also coated somewhat on the inside. So the internal wastegate, little flapper here, is coated both sides. I did some porting. I took quite a bit of material out for the wastegate so it would flow a little more, and that's all been coated in here. Of course, it's not coated the machine surfaces where it is a tight tolerance to the turbine wheel. So I'm going to reassemble this, get my EGT sensor bungs on, and header wrap this so that this is all ready to go in the car. And then there's a few other things I'm going to do to hopefully contain the heat of this exhaust and let it not affect the intake or anything else going on in the engine bay. Well, am I the only one that gets in the engine bay and makes engine noises? Another thing I wanted to do to keep the intake air temp down is to install this panel. Now, the turbo sits right about here, and I'd say right here would be where the turbine is. And then this is the air intake that mounts on the turbo, so it mounts to the front of the compressor, and then is right about here. It's actually down a little further in there. So my idea is that put this panel on, I'll put a little bit of heat shielding on it right here, and then I'll cut a piece of heat shielding that fits tight to this, that kind of fills that gap. So all the fresh air coming in from outside will keep the other side of the panel cool, and this will prevent any radiant heat from the turbo onto the I guess onto the filter, or more or less the idea being that when the car isn't moving along, that it's not getting radiant heat, and I'm not heat soaking the intake every time I stop. I first cut out a piece of like Bristol board or like poster board and some tape, and made a rough template I then transfer that template to a sheet of thin aluminum. It's probably 16 gauge aluminum, or 16 thick, probably, well, yeah, still probably around 18 to 20 gauge aluminum. And then I put a few bends in it so that it fit. Kept test fitting it, climbed in and out of here about 30 times painfully, and got to this point. I had to cut out the section for the filter. It was one of those things of, I would have liked to make a hole in it probably 1 inch bigger than this pipe, but there would be no way for me to mark that, as this panel can't be removed with the engine in, and there'd be no way to get in here. The drill, the turbo would be in the way. So it was kind of the best choice for me was to leave that area open, and I'll fill it with like a heat shield blanket. So this will be riveted on. I'm just going to paint it black, and I'll stick on some thermal barrier right here, and it's just one more way to keep the heat isolated from the intake. Now I got to get out of here. My legs are numb. In one more final effort to keep my air intake temps down, I need to keep the engine bay as low a pressure as possible. So on the intake side, I have the panel we just made, or I just made, you guys didn't help, to keep radiant heat from the turbo away from the intake. Now, without having a flat bottom underneath, air was spilling up. As soon as it cleared the firewall, air would have been coming out into the engine bay. So there would have been, while there'd be fresh air coming in through this intake, there'd also be fresh air coming up from underneath, passing by the turbo, and it would have just been a turbulent area where the filter was. So now we've got that panel there to keep the turbo and the filter separated by that barrier. But if I don't make the turbo side of the engine bay a low pressure, air could still spill, hot air that's from the turbo could still spill into the filter. So if the floor is flat on that side, there's no air coming in. Now any spillage of air is simply going to be from the fresh air side past and around that panel. So there's not going to be any hot air coming towards the filter. There'll only be a little bit of fresh air spilling past into the engine bay by the turbo, which is just fine. Same thing with the intercooler. I haven't really been able to test it to any real extent to find out how effective it is. I do have the fan on there to help with flow. It is at quite of an angle, and I'm not sure how effective the scoop is. We're going to do some wool testing. I'll get into that in the spring. But some aerodynamic testing to see how much air is actually going through there. But if the engine bay is sealed underneath on the inside, the outside will be high pressure. So if the inside is low pressure, air is naturally going to want to flow through. Now, issues with how direct that path is a different thing to solve, and again, I do have the fan to help, but low pressure on this side is only going to help. And finally, one of the main purposes of finishing the flat floor is to actually make the diffuser useful. So Factory 5 sells a nice diffuser, nice diffuser, but it's not that effective because you've got a good 2.5 feet of exposed engine bay. So it's not continuing the flat floor, it's just tacked on the end. So by finishing this, it's actually going to make that diffuser effective and should improve overall downforce. The nice thing about a flat bottom and a diffuser is, despite the fact that it seems like everything's happening on the back of the car, the downforce is actually fairly spread out throughout the car. So this will help with even front downforce and just overall balance of the car. So I just got a thin piece of aluminum that would not fit in my little brake. So in order to get the bends, I actually used a bead roller, which was my first time using it. And anyone who's good with the bead roller, I have mad props for you, because it looks so easy in the videos. Guys are doing sweet designs with bead roll, and I couldn't do straight lines. Fortunately, it'll be under the car and mostly painted black. But yeah, the bead rolls did help out. So you can see that this is actually starting the transition of the diffuser right at the firewall. So I guess about 2/3 way through the car, we're starting to ramp up. I put this one bead roll here just to add rigidity, and then this bead roll and this bead roll actually gave me that little bit of bend I needed, and then of course I had to splice it here. Yes, I could have welded it, but it's thin and that's a pain in the ass, so I just riveted on a little patch piece, and I'll rocker guard the bottom of it to try to keep it from just having paint chip off right away. And I'll rocker guard the sides, and then I'll probably just paint underneath the engine like a gray, something dull. I don't want the shiny aluminum, but something that will actually show if there's an oil leak going on, because I had a bad experience.
What happened?
I had a bad experience. Damn it.
So next up is flushing out the oil lines and oil coolers. And I have a feeling some of you might not like my plan. A general rule of thumb whenever you blow an engine is to clean or replace your oil coolers. The reason for this is you get metallic material in your oil, be it from bearings or broken rods or pistons or all those things. In this case, I did have bearing failure. However, I didn't really notice anything in the oil. That glitter that's so familiar when you have a bearing failure, I didn't really see much of any of that. However, it would be prudent to still clean out my oil coolers and flush my lines. Now, had this engine been actually used more than just idling and driving around my subdivision, and there be a possibility of the oil coolers being gunked up with old oil, like say the RX-8. If I blew the engine in the RX-8, I would be just replacing the oil coolers. I wouldn't try to clean them. There's so much caked on, gunked up stuff, oil in those oil coolers. In this case, I've got all brand new lines, and the oil coolers never really seen any real heat. So my plan is to just flush them, and I'm going to flush the whole system from the front to the back. Now, in the front, I have a thermostat, so I'm going to bypass the thermostat, and I'll just link those lines so that, because typically how it works is the engine oil comes out from the pump, goes into my line here in the front of the engine, loops around the passenger side, goes to the front, goes to the thermostat. If the thermostat is closed, it just comes right back to this side and goes to the filter. If the thermostat's open, then it goes into the passenger side oil cooler, followed by the driver's side oil cooler, and then back to the filter. So my plan is to bypass the thermostat so that I can flush it through the coolers, because I have no way to get the oil up to 180 degrees Fahrenheit to get the thermostat to open up. So I'm actually going to flush it in reverse. The thinking in my mind is that the oil, had it had any metallics in it, would have flowed this way. I guess if you're looking down on the car, it would have flowed counterclockwise. So chances are the material, any foreign material, will be stuck on that side. So if I'm going to flush them out, it's going to be a lot easier to flush out the coolers going the other way. So I've taken my oil pump. It's actually the one I used for the transmission oil. Yes, I did clean it out. And the plan is to just pump fresh oil from what would be the filter inlet through the front, and then out through what would be the front cover outlet typically. If I do get a bunch of glitter in that oil, then I may have to consider replacing the oil filters or taking them off and getting them ultrasonically cleaned. However, I'm not expecting that, and I have an abundance of new oils that I have no use for. I have a bunch of 5W20 and 10W30, things that I have no use for in any of my vehicles, Now is a great time to use them up and get them out of the garage, because if you haven't noticed, my garage could use a little cleaning and getting rid of some stuff. So this bucket, clean oil, we'll be able to see it going through, and then the other oil coming out the other side, we'll see in the bottom, and I'll get a better view for doing that. No, it definitely didn't come out as clean as it went in, but I think it was mostly just a little bit of old oil, just black oil mixed in there, but I'm going to just keep repeating this process till I get it clean. Figure if I'm going to do it the half-assed way, I at least should do a full half-ass. Always make sure that you don't overfill your oil container that you're dumping into. So the oil coolers are all flushed and I'm happy, and I'm reconnecting my thermostat in the front here, and I realized that I had spliced these lines wrong, and I actually made the oil cooler system a solid loop and the two lines coming from the back a loop. So unfortunately all I managed to do was flush the two oil lines going to the oil coolers. So I had to change those out and then do the whole process over again. I had to go buy some more oil. I used a lot of oil. I actually ended up using about 25 liters or so, so like 5-6 gallons. But it is all flushed out now. I did get a little bit more material. Let's see if we can see on this paper. There's that's pretty hard to see. There's some real faint stuff there. It's never going to focus on there. And then in my little strainer, which is actually 190 microns, it's written right on there, you can actually see, hopefully you can see down in there, there's a little bit of material. I did notice once it was flowing through the oil coolers, it was flowing real slow. The pump just, you know, it was going through, but that 1030 was pretty thick. So I went out and I bought some 520 and then I heated it up. It was real backyard style. I bought a bowl, blowtorch, paint stick, stirred it up, heated it up to about 50 degrees Celsius, 45, 50 degrees Celsius. It flowed through like water. The first gallon I put in there got me out a bunch of material, and the second gallon nothing came out. So I'm quite confident now that my oil lines and my oil coolers are completely cleaned, and that's one less thing to do before I can install the engine.